So in this second lecture, I want to talk a little bit about justifying property rights. In the first lecture, we explored what property rights were, in some sense, that is to say a bundle of rights, and we also explored the relationship of that bundle of rights to freedom and disability, or freedom and coercion. There are two broad approaches to justifying property rights, and they lead to very different kinds of property rights regimes and different kinds of they lead to different kinds of ways of setting up property rights and different kinds of limits, shall we say, on how strong or how weak property rights ought to be. Let's start with the less well-known approach. The less well-known approach is the general rights approach, abbreviated GR. The GR approach is actually quite simple. It says property rights are good things to have. People should therefore get to have some. General rights theories of property understand property as being an essential human interest. It's necessary to human flourishing, our development of human beings, our pursuit as human beings, our pursuit of interests. It's impossible, on this view, it's not necessarily impossible to pursue your interest without property rights, but it makes it easier, and it makes it much easier if you have particularly physical property, but also objects and other types of property with which you can ultimately pursue your plan of life. It's very easy to get from general rights theories to things like welfare rights and home mortgage tax deductions and land distribution. Right? The idea is that every man and woman's dignity and welfare depends on having some sphere of action where he or she is in control. Now, the government can certainly help substantiate a lot of your rights, defend a lot of your rights against encroachment by other human beings. However, some you have to pursue on your own, and without property, it's not clear how you're going to pursue your plans of life on your own. And property here doesn't just mean money, although it probably also means money. It means the objects and the physical space within which you can act freely. Right? On this view, every man and woman's dignity also depends on not being too dependent or dominated by others. I mentioned examples in the last video of landlords abusing their tenants, for example, of lords abusing serfs, for example. The idea here is that if you don't own property, you're not independent in some sense. You're always going to be dependent on someone else. Not to mention capitalists abusing their workers, right? Because they ultimately own the means by which a worker can gain any kind of a living, a livelihood. And so that kind of dependence on this sort of view might be offensive to people's dignity. And so, again, the idea is that because property is central to people pursuing their own plans of life rather than the plans of other people, like capitalists or landlords or even the government, property rights are a good thing. So why give people home mortgage tax deductions, right? Why try to make it easier for people to own homes? Well, you make it easier for people to own homes. What that does is that gives them a starting point in life. They don't have to pay rent to anyone, for example, once they fully own their own home. And so the government does little things to encourage home ownership, also encouraging small business creation. In some cases, if welfare rights are sufficiently guaranteed, like if they were constitutionally guaranteed, they might count as a kind of property right. You have a right, if you are below a certain income, to receive a certain basic standard of living. Of course, that's going to be a controversial sort of thing in terms of public policy, but to the extent that it can be guaranteed by law, like all other property rights are guaranteed by law, a property right in some kind of basic standard of living might provide that dignity or independence that a lot of people feel is missing in the landlord-tenant relationship or in the capitalist wage-worker relationship, as long as the wage worker doesn't have property of his own or the tenant doesn't have property of his own, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's general rights, right? The general rights approach simply says that because property is essential to fulfilling certain human goods, you should have some. And the state, therefore, presumably is at least empowered somewhat to trying to make that happen. What about special rights? Locke's view is a special rights view. So is Nozick's, whom we'll read later. The idea here is that people should get property not because property is good necessarily or essential human interest, although it might be, you don't have to deny that, but that's not why people ought to receive property. People ought to receive property because of the things that they have done, right? For Locke especially, it's labor. So if you work on something, there's a sense in which part of that or all of the fruits of that labor ought to come back to you, because in some sense you've mixed yourself, the things that you own, which is your own labor, with something that you don't own and that nobody else owns, hopefully, and therefore you make those objects in the world yours. It's also possible that you can own something because you've purchased it, so you have some money, and someone else owned the property, you purchase it from them. So the reason I own this, so I'm sitting here in my office and I'm holding a candy bar. The reason why I own this candy bar is because I bought it. It's not because it's central to human interest of mine, right? It's not because it's central to living a plan of my own devising for my life. The fact is that I own this candy bar because I bought it from someone. How did I buy it? I bought it with money that I earned through my labor, right? And the reason I was entitled to that money is not because it's a central human interest, but it's because I earned it, and that money is an expression of the value of my labor. Finally, another way that you can do things to receive property is presumably just through accepting it as in the form of a gift, right? When someone gives you something, they don't give it to you necessarily because you're particularly deserving. Certainly with parents, with their children, right? When parents give gifts to their children, it's not always because the children deserve the gifts, or they've earned it, or they've done anything to get it. They do it because they love it. They love their children, and the children receive it in some sense through acceptance. And that's how they come to own that property. So in each of these cases, property comes to people, and the reason why people are morally entitled to hold their property is because they've done specific things in order to get it. And in that sense, the bond that forms between individuals and property is a special bond, right? It's not some general claim to having some property. It's a very specific claim to have very specific kinds of property, right? My claim is not to any kind of candy bar. It's to this candy bar, because that's the one that I bought, the one that I selected from the store. Okay, so the way to look at special rights in some ways is to say that each of us has little invisible strings tying us specially with objects in the world, objects that we have labored, and we have submitted the inputs so as to get them as our just reward, right? And so, we are all tied to certain objects and not tied to other objects. And the objects that we're tied to, we have some special claim over. Maybe it's not a absolute claim, but nonetheless, it helps justify why that particular piece of property is mine. And in some sense, right? If you were to ask a farmer, right, who's labored on his land for many, many years, and in some sense made the land, imbued the land with his or her personality, that farmer would say that it's that land that's theirs, not some piece of land that they're entitled to, that piece of land, right? And that's the sort of the strength of the special rights view. The strength is that our intuitions are that we own very specific types of property for very specific historical reasons, having to do with how we've interacted and what actions that we've conducted with respect to that property, not that we're entitled to some property, right, because we're good people. On the other hand, the special rights view at least has to admit that it's possible that some people will get all the property and that other people will not have any property, and that's a problem that the general rights view can easily solve and the special rights view struggles with. Okay, so there's advantages and disadvantages to the special rights view and the general rights view, which is why people still debate about which is the right way to justify property rights. So let's talk about Locke's specific view. Again, Locke is a special rights kind of account, and Locke says, look, you can acquire stuff that you labor on as long as it's not owned by anybody else. So I can't go work on, your car for a while and then make it mine, right? That's not how it works. Locke says you can appropriate things out in nature that are not owned. But Locke is aware that property is potentially a double-edged sword, and so he builds in limits to how much you can acquire any particular piece, how much property you can acquire, right? So in this sense, he's trying to solve this problem that special rights potentially could lead to a few people owning all the property. One of his limits is called the spoilage clause. He says you can only get so much as you don't let spoil, right? So if you acquire too much, some of it's going to spoil, and he's talking very specifically about natural, presumably produce and stuff like that, crops and things like that. You can't take so much that it'll spoil. And the second proviso, and that's the more interesting one, says that you should leave enough and as good in common for others. And what that means is subject to a lot of debate. Now, Locke's is a labor theory of property. What that means is that labor plays a special role in tying individuals to specific objects. And indeed, most of our legitimate claims to specific objects in the world, Locke thinks, has to be justified by reference to some past labor, or some past actions anyway, that people actions that people have taken towards those goods. So it's the way in which something uniquely yours, your labor, mixes with something that's in common or unowned. Your labor is your property, so you can choose where you dispose of your labor, and that's in part what makes you a free person, is that your labor is your property. In some sense, Locke thought that all rights were property rights, right? They were your property, what was proper to you as a human being. And you could have some general rights against everyone and some special rights to, for instance, someone promised you something, you have a special right to have that promise fulfilled by that person, but not a general right by anybody to fulfill that promise. Okay. There are some mysteries, though, within Locke's view. Locke clearly stipulates that not all labor is going to count as giving you title to land, right? It's got to be productive labor. But why is that? And what counts as labor? Or what even counts as productive labor? That's a bit of a mystery, right? Because people can do all kinds of unproductive things to the land, and Locke is trying to say, well, some of those things aren't going to count as giving you ownership of that land. For instance, Locke defends this view by saying that God did not intend us to do things to run against our survival, but if we try to take God out of the equation, which not everyone is persuaded that God does intend this, or even that there is a God that intends this, can Locke's view be defended, or does Locke's view stand or fall with 17th century English Protestantism? So you have to come up with some idea, some non-theistic idea of what counts as productive labor, or why productive labor should matter. Now, I think we have reason to respect contributions that people make towards our common good, right? And so, to the extent that, people do things that ultimately increase our options or our opportunities, perhaps we have grounds to respect that. But again, we would have to come up with a more precise account. And it's worth noting that labor mixing itself has been thought to be weird. Why is it that when I mix my labor with unowned land, the land becomes mine, rather than me having wasted my labor? That's not clear at all, right? Nozick has the example of pouring a can of tomato juice into the sea. Is it the case that I've suddenly acquired the sea, or is it more plausibly that I have wasted my tomato juice? Right, so if I turn a few apple seeds into an orchard, why is that orchard mine? Why isn't it that I haven't just given an orchard to nature? I think we can answer this question, but Locke doesn't, and so it constitutes a bit of a mystery. Now, so Locke places the sufficiency restriction on property acquisition, right? Individuals cannot take so much that there is not enough and as good left in common for others. And intuitively, I think this makes sense. You don't want some people to take everything, and you want to leave something for future generations, so you don't want people who come in there first to get all the rewards, so to speak. And I think the second way this makes sense is there's a kind of a balance here, right? If you're going to take, you have to also give, right? It's sort of a give and take thing. If you just take, it seems like the world's out of balance. But if you take and give back as good as what you got, well, then who can complain, right? But it's not clear what it means to leave enough and as good left in common. At its most restrictive, it might mean that no property can be acquired, right? Because literally every time you fence a piece of property off from the earth, that's less for anybody else to take, right? That's less in common. But clearly Locke doesn't mean that. So what did he actually mean? Well, maybe he meant something like leaving enough opportunities in common, right? So if my closing off this property enables me to securely work on it hard enough to create more value, well, then I've created some effective demand for goods and services in the economy. Maybe I'm in a position to offer someone a job to work on my property. Point being, I take virgin land, but through labor and mixing my labor with the land, I create opportunity, I create wealth, and so I leave enough and as good in common for latecomers who maybe they can't take property, but they can certainly take opportunities that are equivalent to taking property. Other people say, well, what this means is ultimately you have to pay a tax to the government or a tax to the community in exchange for your property to make sure that others are not too hurt by my exclusion of them. Again, it's a mystery. It's a mystery that lots has been written on. But whatever the options are, I think it is intuitively something that needs to be defended for any special rights view. Any special rights view needs to explain why some people can't just take everything. Because otherwise it just doesn't seem the property is fulfilling the role that it needs to fill. You might even ask yourself, what social function does property have? Right. Some people, though, say, you know what? Maybe the proviso isn't even a restriction. After all, isn't it better to be born in a world of non-ownership isn't it better to be born in a world where everything's owned than a world where almost nothing is owned? I mean, is it better to be born today in North America or in 1700 when Locke was writing? Right? Can you have any kind of complex division of labor, industry, commerce without well-developed property rights? Can you have iPods and cell phones and MRIs and transcontinental travel without private property? Property is not just an appropriate recognition for your hard work, but it's also a powerful incentive to improve the land, a powerful incentive to make things better. And without property, it's not clear what could as powerfully incentivize people to work hard. Now, you can certainly, at the point of a gun, force people to work hard, but can you force them to be creative? Can you force them to think? Can you force them to innovate? That's the power of property, is that when people are assured the gains of their labor, they are likely to apply more creativity, perhaps, than they would otherwise. On this view, property owners are leaving plenty enough as good and in common. They're leaving job opportunities that don't involve farming or soldiering. I mean, think about the types of jobs that were available when Locke was writing and the types of jobs that are available today. Today, you can find a job to suit almost any temperament. Back then, if you didn't want to be a farmer and didn't want to be a soldier, your options were pretty narrow. If you were lucky, maybe you could work for the church. So the division of labor has resulted in many, many opportunities for people with many kinds of psychological makeups, and it's in a way to take advantage of people's talents that didn't exist before. So on that view, maybe Locke is a kind of consequentialist after all. It's not the dignity of labor that's being respected by you respecting people's labor. It's the fact that labor is a good thing, and it's good that people are incentivized to work hard, and property rights provide the incentive for people to work hard, flourish, and promote and provide opportunities, including for people who come late and don't have a chance to acquire physical property, or they do have a chance to acquire physical property just through accumulation of initial labor, I suppose, rather than just fencing it off from nature. Okay. Further mysteries. Another mystery that's been or accusation almost, that's been leveled at Locke, or something that's been thought to be mysterious about Locke, is how can a unilateral act on the part of one person change the rights and duties of everyone else on the planet, particularly without their consent, right? You labor on stuff, and suddenly other people have to refrain from going where they couldn't go before. why don't I get a say, right? Why don't other people get a say on what you do? Why is it not the case, as some have thought, that you are limited to reaping the fruits of your labor and maybe reaping the value of the improvements you make to the land? But why do you get the land on top of that? There is a trend in scholarship called Georgism and left libertarianism, which takes just this view, and uses Locke just in this way, right? They say Locke was correct to saying that your labor gives you special title to something, but it doesn't give you the whole land. It just gives you title to the improvements, right? So on this view, if you turn an apple into an orchard, you certainly have a right to all the fruits of your hard work, but what you don't have a right to is the value of the land itself, just the value of its improvements. And certainly that value of the improvements could be unlimited, but the right to the raw materials themselves, left libertarians and Georgists are much more skeptical that you could ever appropriate that through your labor mixing. A final mystery. Even if you agree with Locke about the foundations of a right to exclude, that is to say, you're like, yes, you're on the right track, Locke, people have a right to appropriate things, you still haven't said much about the extent of what you've justified, right? Locke says we justify property, but which parts of the bundle have we justified? Are Lockean property rights strong, or are they weak? Are they easily defeasible by other human rights and concerns? So, for example, if someone is really needy, are my strong property rights going to prevent me, or going to prevent anyone else to take my property in order to serve those needs? Or are property rights really strong in the sense that other people can have important claims that I have a right to refuse on the grounds that it's my property and therefore it's my freedom to do with it as I wish? So this is the sort of the final mystery, is that even if we think that special rights are the way to go, it's not clear how much we've justified at the end of the day. So a lot of people, as a result, have become skeptical of this sort of justification and have looked for other ways, maybe more conventional ways, that is to say, and by conventional here, what I mean is by reference to social convention, that is to say, property rights are in some sense what we think they are. And as a result, they have to be defined by the state so that we can have stable expectations or something like that. But note that on that view, property rights loses its special convention, its conventional status, and it becomes more of a general rights justification with all the disadvantages of a general rights justification. So I'll finish with this. I'm going to ask you, do you think property can be justified on special rights grounds, or do you think it has to be a general rights sort of justification?